Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon to talk about addiction. And before we go into anything, before we go into introductions, I just wondered if we could have a bit of a shout out from our audience around what do you think when you hear the word addiction? What does it mean to you?
Drugs.
Drugs. Drugs. Anyone else?
Champagne.
Champagne?
Sugar.
Oh, sugar. So I hear sugar. No, champagne, and you said sugar.
Sugar.
Habitual.
Habitual.
Illness.
Gambling.
Illness? I said illness. Okay, great. What have we got there?
Habitual. Gambling? Did someone say gambling?
Out of control.
Out of control. Okie dokie. And just a show of hands, how many of you within your organisations have ever had to actually deal with someone who's had an addiction, whether it's as a colleague, whether it's as HR, whether it's as a line manager? Wow. Well, that's really, really interesting. I do want to emphasise that we're quite a chatty panel, and so if we can make this a little bit more discursive as we go through, that would be really interesting, because it would be great to hear some of your experiences and what you think you did right, but equally also what you think you did wrong, because it's quite a tricky thing, I think, to get right. Anyway, so thanks for coming along, and over the next 45 minutes, what we're going to try and do is talk a little bit around addiction, what it actually means, what some of the characteristics of an addict are, what sort of environments allow addiction to flourish or for people to really struggle in those environments. But most importantly, I think, what organisations can actually start to do differently. And I think that's where it will be really, really great to draw on some of your experiences. And I think before I actually introduce the panel, because we've turned it from a workshop into a panel, hope you don't mind, is that if there's one thing that me and my fellow panellists would love everyone to walk out of this room thinking... Sorry, I've got a slight cold. Am I sounding a bit croaky? Anyway, the one thing that we would love you to walk out of this room thinking is that we absolutely, urgently need to destigmatise addiction. So there's some amazing work happening out in the world at the moment around destigmatising mental illness. And there's a lot of talk, I mean, huge column inches around depression, around anxiety, around stress, around bipolar. We've got celebrities coming forward. We've got sportsmen and women coming forward. And finally, we've actually got business people coming forward. And there's some really inspirational things happening where leaders, a cross-section of the organisation, are really sharing their stories and normalising it. But addiction is really, really absent from these conversations. And what I think is absolutely extraordinary is that Mind did a study a couple of years ago where 60% of people who are suffering from mental illness also have a substance dependency. So when we look at all these, economics of the situation, let alone the moral case, there's a huge economic case to be made to tackling addiction differently. And if it's the bedfellow of depression and anxiety and stress, we absolutely have a job to do. Because I think the trouble is that most people think addiction, they think drugs, it's filthy, it's sordid, it's sex, it's gambling, it's cocaine. I mean, it is not a pretty topic, but it is a mental illness, and it is treatable. And I think we absolutely have to start making it part of the conversation, otherwise it's only half of the story. Anyway, that was my kind of opening rant. So, to introduce my illustrious fellow panellists, I want to get this right. There's lots of psychs in this, and I need to make sure I get the right ones. A few words about myself. I'm Georgie Mack. I'm the managing director of a company called Made by Many, which is a digital innovation consultancy. Nothing, obviously, to do with addiction. But in my spare time, I'm the co-founder of a network called Minds at Work, which is all about the destigmatisation of mental health in the workplace. There's about 1,000 members of that, and I'm really ashamed to say that in all the events that we've run over the last couple of years, not one of them has really focused on addiction. And yet I like to think of myself at the coalface of this topic. So a little bit ashamed of that, really. So I've got here Nikki Walton-Flynn, who is the founder of Addiction Therapy London. There's a stand out there. It's been strangely undervisited, I have to say. She's an addiction psychologist and trauma psychotherapist. Interestingly, she retrained from her first career in media in the telco sector, and she set up Addiction Therapy London to offer really high-quality addiction services to professionals. Then I have Maria Garcia here, who is a clinical psychologist and psychotherapist specialising in addiction and eating disorders. She's worked in the NHS as well as the private sector. And while she hasn't had direct experience of an addiction, she suffered quite a trauma in her 20s, which if she wasn't training in psychology probably could have been a lot more damaging than it was. And last but not least, I have here to my right Alan Doyle, who is a former addict from the city, who's been through rehabilitation, has been clean now for the last 2 years, and is training to be a psychotherapist. And we're going to hear more from Alan very, very shortly. But before we go any further, Nikki, could you just give us, so we're on a level field here, what is the definition of addiction?
Okay, so can people hear me with that mic? So at Addiction Therapy London, we define addiction as a mind-altering experience, a pathological relationship with a mind-altering experience, rather than a substance, because then we cover gambling, sex addiction, pornography, as well as substances.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
And just to follow up on those big stats, that in my city clinic, I would say that 70% of my patients are also presenting with symptoms of anxiety and depression as well as addiction.
Okay, so it's kind of borne out on a micro level.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, is that better? Oh my God, that's so much. Even I can tell that's a lot better. Okay, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to actually ask Alan to share his story with us, because I think there's some really profound insight that we can draw from it. And I would like to say, I also want to acknowledge that that is incredibly courageous of you. It's not easy when you sit there and talk about a topic like addiction, especially when I've just called it filthy and sordid and all the rest of those things. I'm sure he was flinching in the background. But do you want to start by...
Yeah, sure. I'm not feeling very brave right now.
Do you want to hold this? It might help.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, as Georgie said, I'm currently training to be a psychotherapist, but until... very recently had a 20-year career in the city, and I would say for every one of those 20 years I was living as an addict. I think from therapy I have recognised I was actually an addict from the age of 14 years old. When I first picked up a drink, I was a blackout drinker from day one. I drank differently to everyone else. And there has been some terrible consequences to my addiction. I've been fired from jobs I loved. Relationships broke down. I've been hospitalised many times. And, you know, any one of those consequences to a normal person might have been a sort of wake-up call to say there's something badly wrong here. But unfortunately the addict's mind doesn't work like that, and it just didn't even register. It was almost to medicate feelings from incidents that happened. You were just almost more keen to get back to using again. So I talked about the consequences. There was one consequence. I was working for a global pharmaceutical company on a very prestigious graduate training scheme. I was doing really well. I loved the job. I was a bit of the golden boy on the scheme, sort of the best performing graduate. So everything was looking very bright and rosy, and then the annual conference came along. Now, to my fellow graduate colleagues, the annual conference was the perfect networking event for them to meet important people and start to raise their profile. What I saw when I saw conference was party. So I turned up with a big bag of Coke, a load of vodka, and my behaviour at the conference resulted in me being fired on the following Monday morning. So I'd gone from golden boy to out on the street in a matter of hours, and it was all entirely my fault. So I was devastated. Now, you might think that would actually, again, be a wake-up call, but, you know, the feelings of shame, severe embarrassment, stupidity. The addict just needs to medicate those away. So again, that's exactly how you cope with it. Those unbearable feelings as a result of what you've done to yourself.
So then, what did you do after?
So after that disaster, I kind of fell into the city, really. But at a level, I was about 26 then, and I then kind of, because obviously I'm not going to get a reference from the pharmaceutical company, I kind of fell into a job where I could have left school at 16 and been in the job. So it was a difficult time. But it did get a lot better, and I had another 20 years in the city job where I was, I enjoyed the job a lot of the time, but I was, under the shadow of addiction the whole time I was doing it. And, it's a progressive illness. So at the start of those 20 years, it wouldn't have been so bad. By the end of the 20 years, I was under the influence every single day.
So how did you actually, what enabled you to carry on functioning within your workplace? I mean,
I think the work hard, play hard culture of the city, helped a lot. I worked for MDs where, as long as you brought the deals in and those deals were properly executed, they didn't really mind too much what else you did or how you behaved, and that was the culture. And I was an addict before I started there, but there was an element of being able to hide in plain sight because of the social aspect of the drinking that went on in the city, both with clients and with colleagues.
So would it be fair to say towards the end of that particular job role, you were probably not sober at any point during the day when you were at work?
Yeah, it's like I said, it's progressive. So, and each time you cross the boundary, it went from just caning it all weekend and not being able to function till Wednesday, to only having a drink before work on a Friday morning, to and then progressively, and then by the end it would be I'd be drinking before work every single day.
Right. What happened with things in terms of your career progression? I mean, did you just kind of ossify on one level? What happened around promotion?
Yeah, I was very careful to stay in my comfort zone, even to the extent where senior people would say, really think you should go for these jobs. That happened twice, where obviously someone senior says that to you, that's a reasonably good steer. But I was terrified of exposing myself. I've had this feeling, the addict feels like it's barely clinging on to their existence. And so to expose myself more would have just been completely terrifying.
And do you think your sort of behaviour was normalised in the industry?
I'd say it's not normal at all, but I definitely think it's accepted in some industries more than others. Because when I think back to my behaviour at the pharmaceutical company conference, I've seen worse than that at city conferences without any disciplinary action being taken. So yeah, I think there is an acceptance of it in some industries more than others.
And what was going on in your personal life whilst this was going on?
Well, there'd been a lot of ups and downs, all due to the addiction. But ultimately, I was kicked out of the family home. So yeah, my wife had enough, so I left family home, wife and 2 kids, and ended up staying in hotels and Airbnb rentals for 2 months of utter chaos.
And what made you eventually stop? Because you were kicked out of your family home.
Yeah.
When did your big epiphany
Well,
come?
the crazy thing is, you'd think that would be another big signal you've been removed from your family home to go and live in a Premier Inn. You'd think that would be something I'm not prepared to do. I need to address this. But the weird thing is, you actually think, phew, now I can do exactly whatever I want. The controlling influence is gone. I can just go for it. But that was a death spiral. So 2 months into that of behaving like that, I came to on the floor of a Premier Inn. There are 6, 7 bottles of Smirnoff strewn everywhere. I'd just come to. I hadn't woken up. I'd come to, and I realised that it wasn't going to last much longer. I had lost my home. My job was still there, but for how much longer, I couldn't tell. But death was around the corner. So that was the moment I got scared enough to do something about it.
So it kind of hit crisis point at that moment. And big question, I mean, could anyone within your organisation have done anything to help earlier? And what could that have looked like?
I was so terrified that I would do anything to keep it hidden. I was really secretive, lying. But it was the fear. So the fear of the stigma, and there was always something, there's so many restructures since the financial crash, or, the bonus announcement was coming up, and you were just terrified of, you admitting this, that you've got this illness would have an impact on any of those things coming up. So I think if that fear and stigma had been reduced, and you had a knowledge that you could speak openly about this, I think that would have helped.
Yeah, it's interesting because you had, correct me if I'm wrong, you had a really bad accident as well, didn't you?
Yeah.
A few weeks before, and still no one really joined up.
Yeah, I mean that was actually about 3 years before. I was unconscious for 18 hours after an accident, which ended up with me having 50, 60 stitches. And I was off work for 2 weeks, and it was an accident due to my addiction. And at that point, mental health professionals, my family, therapists all said, you need to go to residential rehab. So these sorts of sticking plaster things that I'd been doing up to that point just to keep people happy were never going to work. You need to go to residential rehab for 3 months. But again, I was terrified, because what am I going to say to work?
Yeah.
And the fear of doing that prevented me.
And when you actually did go on rehab, you
Yeah.
told work you had depression, didn't you?
Yeah.
As opposed to, because actually depression had less stigma attached to it.
Yeah. I remember a bizarre conversation with a colleague where we were trying to work out what I was going to say. And so I said, well, should I do stress or anxiety? And she said, but you're the least stressed or anxious person in the office. So
there is a gallows humour.
So we settled on depression, and and again that's the stigma.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not great going to your boss saying you've got depression, but hey, it's better than addiction.
Yeah. And I just think, hearing Alan's story, that it's difficult to imagine that someone wasn't able to join the dots up. There's horrific accidents, there's, smelling of alcohol. But again, it's just such a difficult conversation to have. Where do you start, as long as someone is sort of performing? Very, very difficult. Okay, well, thank you very, very much for sharing that with us. Now, Nikki, over to you. Can we hear a little bit about your story before we tuck into some of the kind of clinical sides of this?
Okay, so like Alan, I was drinking to blackout from the age of 13 in order to self-care really and to self-soothe. And just in that statement, you've got 2 13, 14-year-old children drinking to blackout. There's something really wrong with that statement. I mean, we can touch on that later. My story really is pretty textbook, so privileged middle-class background, nanny, boarding school, that kind of stuff. But in relation to my addiction at work, I was a functioning addict at work for about 9 to 10 years. And on reflection, I managed this by just staying under the radar. So I didn't go for promotions, I didn't put myself forward, I didn't volunteer anything unless it was asked of me. So I just stayed quiet. And I was managing the substance addiction with really excessive exercise outside of work. So I was playing tennis 5 nights a week, cycling 12 miles to work every day. So kind of exercising, if you like, what I thought was a really healthy lifestyle. So I was kind of working hard and playing hard. But I didn't escape disciplinary action, and eventually I was kind of micromanaged just before I ended up in rehab myself. So, dissimilar to Alan's story, my manager did actually approach me after her own breakdown. So she had a nervous breakdown through work-related stress. And she approached me, not about my addiction, but explicitly, but she did approach me and say she thought I might benefit from speaking to somebody. In a word, I just rejected it and said I was fine, because I believed I was fine at the time. But I think in hindsight, what she noticed about my presentation was that I was always defended, I was really nervous, I didn't spend any money on clothes, I didn't join in with kind of team nights out because I couldn't go to the pub and have one drink like the rest of them. Basically, I was unable to contribute to the team. And what I now know, on Monday mornings, I used to regularly have alcohol-induced partial seizures at my desk when nobody, I mean, I don't know whether anybody would know what a partial seizure would look like if you were a manager, but I think in hindsight, what would have helped me with that manager, rather than rejecting her, was if she had been able to be very explicit about what she was seeing in me. So had she had some kind of training in spotting signs of addiction, or being able to say to me, you know, you regularly smell of alcohol, you're really anxious all of the time, you're crying a lot. You know, it's stuff that people in the workplace would look and think, oh, maybe she's suffering with anxiety. Maybe there's something wrong in her relationship. But I think I would have clung on to that because I was hanging on by my fingernails at that point. So had somebody been able to say, I think actually you might have an issue. Do you have an issue with alcohol? Do you have an issue with drugs? That would have been something that I could have welcomed at that point. That's.
And do you think it is something that was particular to the industries that you worked in, or that brought out the addict in you, if you will?
Like Alan, I was it certainly enabled it. So I was working in media and telecoms at the time, mobile telecoms certainly, because there were lots of parties, lots of client lunches, that kind of stuff. But the addict in me would have drunk addictively, no matter what industry I was in. Yeah. It wouldn't have mattered where I was. I would have found a way, but I would not have been able to do it so overtly, if you like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that same view?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's the phrase hiding in plain sight, where I could indulge my addiction because other people who are using alcohol, sensibly, or maybe not so sensibly, but not addictively, you could just join in.
I mean, one of the things that, because obviously you've been chatting to Nikki and Alan about their stories, that really struck me was the kind of, almost the contradiction when you think about an addict and being out of control, but yet there's this, and you used this word actually, unbelievably organised side to addiction. And I mean, you didn't say this in your story, but you used to get up at 5 a.m. to go to the gym and work out. But didn't you not back some vodka and disabled Lou first? Right, okay.
Towards the end, that was every day.
Yeah, but still, if you are there looking in on this story and you're seeing someone running home or cycling home or getting up at 5 a.m. to go to the gym, it just, you almost can use that as a way of perhaps saying, they're working out, they must be okay. I mean, it just seems such an inherently contradictory behaviour to what one imagines or associates with addiction. I think it's quite incredible, the sort of almost calculating, organised side that comes with addiction.
It's a desperate strive for balance.
Yeah.
It's a desperate strive to control, to manage.
So could we now, just on the kind of clinical side, if you will, talk about perhaps some of the insights that you might be able to draw from your story, Nikki, and from Alan's story? What are some of the
Yeah.
observations you would make?
Yes, I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to rush. I think the most unsettling aspects of both mine and Alan's story is that we were both drinking at the ages of 13 and 14 in order to kind of manage difficult emotions and to self-care, even though those stories might be very different. And this really highlights two underlying causes of how people, two of the three routes into addiction, if you like. So in order for addiction to be present, there has to be an opportunity. So if there isn't an opportunity to drink, to use drugs, to act out sexually, to gamble, it doesn't happen. Okay, so opportunity always has to be present. But there's a recognition amongst all clinicians that trauma and attachment lead into addiction as well. So in Alan's case, though he didn't touch on this, there was an episode of the death of a childhood friend when you were in
Chronic
school,
OCD.
and he developed chronic OCD in order to manage his own fear of death around that. So that would be big T trauma. And in my own case, it was a combination of attachment bond in boarding school and big T trauma. So there are kind of three routes in, if you like, to addiction. And both of our stories do a great job of exhibiting that. And I think it's also a good point to differentiate between somebody who uses, somebody who abuses, and an addict. So a user can use socially and recreationally. There won't be a preoccupation, there won't be an obsession, there won't be a kind of when can I next drink, when can I next party. An abuser will use excessively, but if they were to face one or other of the consequences that Alan or I faced, they would stop. They would have that mindset to stop. An addict doesn't stop. So there are three kind of categories of
Right.
using, if you like.
Right. Actually, yeah, no, I found that quite useful when thinking about it as well. So Maria, can you talk a little bit around the characteristics, if you like, that make a good addict? Which is a terrible thing to say, and I apologise, but I know.
Sure. So just to say that there is no clinical sort of addictive personality criteria as it is. We can talk about how addicts or people that struggle with addiction tend to have similarities in their maybe their personality traits, but there's no clinical sort of characteristic of addictive personality. But we have on the one end we have the risk taking, the impulsivity, we have the instant gratification, we have the someone that's always looking for that reward very, very fast, and they'll go to whatever extent to get that. So the city, I suppose, in that kind of, we look at whether that would encourage the addict, well, I suppose it's the perfect place for someone to want more and always have that, So we have the control, we have the perfectionism as well, which can be good and on the one side, but then very, very damaging.
So can I just say, so in some ways, a lot of the characteristics that make someone a very desirable hire
Yes.
are the very characteristics that make them vulnerable.
Exactly. But at the same time, we also have the I suppose the person that is very good at their job, but then maybe a little bit withdrawn. So maybe a little bit, instead of that comfortable socially, maybe a bit awkward, or they might not want to be socializing that much. And that person can also be struggling. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. I mean, we have the low self-esteem as well, and it can be masked by the perfectionism, or it can be masked by very sort of socially inadequacy, uncomfortable around other people. So there are a lot of characteristics, and definitely there is the inability to deal with the emotional maybe problems, and how that might have stemmed from the past, which is what Nikki and Alan were talking about. But how it manifests is in different sort of ways of trying to fix themselves. So whether it's the risk-taking, the impulsivity, or the goal-seeking, and that sort of thing. So controlling. Yeah.
Okay. And then, so that's a little bit about the kind of characteristics within a person, but then what about the sort of roles, jobs that someone might go for, or the environment that might be very attractive to an addict? Sorry, microphone.
Yeah, microphone.
Addict, not microphone.
So the kinds of jobs and roles that are going to really seduce an addict and attract an addict are those, like Maria's just touched on, that are going where they will have a certain degree of control over what they do. for example, so they might be in charge of their own accounts, there's kind of elastic budgets and that kind of stuff. But there's also a pressure to perform at a high level, and the irony of that is that addicts need that constant affirmation. They're looking for the external affirmation all of the time. So if there's a requirement to constantly perform and constantly, achieve, it's a double-sided coin for somebody who has a propensity to addiction, because they'll be pulled to it like a moth to a flame, but it will also be the downfall of them. But the city, going back to what Maria was saying about the city, it has this high reward and high gratification, which is the dopamine hit. So those industries where you get big bonuses and it's an instant reward and instant gratification, those are going to be a big lure for addicts. And can I just bang on about dopamine?
Yeah, no, I have to tell you, Nikki's obsessed with this. So I've given her... she's
Just
got
very, very quickly.
40 seconds.
Okay, I've got
dopamine.
40 seconds to talk about dopamine. Dopamine is the common denominator in every single addiction, whether it's substances or whether it's behavioural. So whether it's gambling, sex, cocaine, anything you like. Any addiction, you have dopamine at the root of it. And it's a reward driver. It's a motivator towards pleasure and reward. And it gets heightened through anticipation and fantasy, okay? And it's linked to memory bias. So if the memory bias is, if I behave like this, I get a massive big bonus, and combine that with something like cocaine, which is also boosting dopamine neurotransmitters, it just goes like this. So is that 40 seconds?
Yeah.
Can I stop?
You did very well.
Okay.
Okay, so now we're going to move on because we actually don't have much time, and I think this is quite a meaty part of it, which is I'm just going to ask Maria to talk a little bit around what employers can indeed start thinking about doing differently within organisations. And I think this would be really, really good to hear back from some of you who've been dealing or have dealt with addicts within your organisations in the past, just to see what your experiences were, and actually if there's some useful learning that everyone can take away from it. So please don't be shy.
Yeah,
Maria.
no, definitely. So I think thank you for coming today, because I think it's important that you that you take that step. I mean, the fact that you're able to come here, that you're brave enough, really, because addiction can be very scary, can be really.
You might have been
stigma-
judged coming into this room.
Yeah, exactly. So well done for coming here and making that decision to help your employees. I suppose the main thing for us is to transmit a message that you can do something about it. You can help people, and actually, the fact that you are intervening, if you actually do that, if you say something to that employee or just approach them, you might be able to change how the process of the addiction. So it might continue to escalate. We're not responsible for that, but we can make a difference in just planting that seed that we're here for you, we can help you. So I think it's essential for you as managers and HR and whatever your role is in the organization to be able to do that. And I think for that to happen, you need to be reassured that there's a way out of it. So there's treatment. That the stigma is there, but we can talk about it. We can talk about addiction. So not only for the employee, but for yourself to be comfortable and say, okay, I know about addiction, which is maybe what we're trying to do here, trying to teach you a little bit more about addiction so that you feel comfortable with saying, okay, I know what I'm talking about, and I'm not afraid to talk about it. And I think that's really important as part of the, taking away the stigma from it.
But isn't it true to say that one of the biggest things is that within any organisation, that if it's not played out at leadership level, you can bring in all these different interventions and you might as well, to some degree, be tearing your money up. So I think that's one of the things that we've learned, certainly from the work that we've been doing around depression, anxiety and stress, that actually if that is properly and authentically talked about at leadership level, that creates the permission within an organisation for services, products, help, assistance to be taken a lot more seriously and credibly than perhaps otherwise.
No, definitely. I mean, I think, because one of the things that we came up with, which was quite interesting, is when someone is struggling with addiction, it can look as if there's something else going on. So it could look like depression, it could look like anxiety, it could look like maybe just stress, burnout at work, it could look like there's relationship problems at home, it could look like anything. But at the same time, the addiction could be there. It could be masked by all of these sort of presentations and symptoms. And actually, Nikki and I were talking about how the withdrawal from a lot of these drugs looks like that. It looks like depression. It looks like anxiety. It just looks like irritability. And I mean, maybe it's worth going through the signs, but so what
because it is, because that
Exactly.
is what you will be suffering from if you are withdrawing. You will be anxious. You will be depressed. You will be stressed. You will be tearful. You will be all of those things.
Before can we hear from the floor? Is anyone willing to talk about their experience? Gentleman at the back.
Is this working?
First of all, just to compliment you on the fact that you're having this discussion on addiction. We would not have sat in this room 3 years ago with more than 10 people under this subject. So it's and it's very, very relevant. I worked with a pub company that had pubs throughout the city for 10 years, and it was like doing a PhD in addiction. During that time, I was a recovering alcoholic, which I'm 25 years and 6 months sober now.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I'd like to compliment Nikki and Alan for having the ability and the strength to go up there and share their experience. Addiction is cunning, powerful and baffling. It confuses everybody, it controls everybody, and it's not easy to deal with in the workplace, but it's in the workplace. The city is a breeding ground, and it's a very forgiving place for an alcoholic or for an addict of any case. However, on the other side of it, and I think we must give fantastic credit to the company that are putting themselves out here today. Within the Square Mile, there's also the greatest support within the Anonymous, the Alcoholics Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous, Sex Addiction Anonymous, anything you can mention. The support in the meetings within hundreds of yards of this building is outstanding. There's meetings from 6 o'clock in the morning till 11 o'clock at night. And one of the things, through either your own company or if there are people in HR, no harm in sticking those numbers up in discreet places around the office, because there are people looking for help.
Okay.
Well done.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Any other stories from how anyone has dealt with someone with addiction in their organisation? No, quite a show of hands earlier.
I'll come in with the mic now.
Just and again, echo the thanks for your stories and that, sharing them. I guess it's this thing about denial and how much you should press on someone when you see the signs, just in case you're wrong, I guess. Maybe not articulating it very well, but this aspect of denial that you can confront a person. And they say, no, you're wrong.
If you were wrong, what would that feel like as a manager? Sorry, that's a bit of a therapy question. The wrong hat on here. How mortifying would it be for you if you were wrong?
I guess it would be partially mortifying, but not as bad as if you were able to help someone recover.
Absolutely.
So I suppose you're turning around to that you even if you're wrong sometimes, the one occasion when you're right more than makes up for the wrong occasions.
Yes, and you might introduce the conversation, if I'm wrong, I apologise.
And I guess you could also, provided you're doing it from a compassionate point of view.
Yes, the motivation, so long if you're coming from the right place of motivation, then... But I think you're raising a really important point because denial is the biggest struggle in all of the work we do as therapists with addicts, because that's the first point that you have to work through. So as I was with my manager, I was in absolute denial. If there's anything wrong with me? No, I'm fine. There was not absolutely I wasn't fine, and there was part of me knew that I wasn't fine. But what would have helped if she had been able to say, the reason I'm asking you these questions around substances, or I'm wondering whether there's something else going on as well, rather than just anxiety, is because I identify A, B, and C, and X, Y, and Z, that would have been reassuring.
Do you think that would have just been in your case or for addicts per se, based on your experience of dealing with addicts?
I think that depends where you're at with your condition or with your disease. I mean, I was at the end of the road with mine. But a couple of years earlier, there would have been a rejection still. So, but I think it's worth thinking about your motivation and just hanging on to that idea. But I might this might be helpful for this person. Yeah, and I might get kicked back, but...
So has anyone done that in the room? Approached someone that they had a pretty good suspicion that they were suffering from addiction? Anyone done that? No? Okay, there was such a big show of hands earlier, I thought maybe that might have been the
What
case.
about with anxiety and depression? Has anyone approached any?
And had that conversation? And what happened? Are you able to talk a little bit about?
It was actually myself.
Right. Okay.
Because it's recognising that you're going in a certain way and it's the wrong way, but you can't see it. And then it's not until you either have an accident before it happens that you're going downwards and you still can't see it. And she was saying, I got it because I got stressed from work and it was because I was a high performer. And I was addicted to the high performing.
Exactly, yeah.
It's your dopamine.
Yeah. And, you know, I went down like a ton of bricks and it really taught me a lot about it, but recognising it within myself, I couldn't see it. You know, my boss actually recognised it in me. I was very fortunate. I had a really good person that was sort of openly saying, you need to go home, Lucy, you need to...
Well, I have to say that is almost a great way to end, because that didn't happen with you. That didn't. I mean, you reached crisis point, and the point is, someone recognised it in you, was able to have that conversation, and probably by the sound of it, saved you before you got to crisis point. So again, spending the time, I think, learning how to have that conversation is just such a crucial first step when it comes to the whole topic. We are nearly at 3:00.
Can I just add something? Because it was really interesting when you all put your hand up when we asked at the beginning. So it sounds like you had maybe the suspicion that someone was struggling with addiction, but then did you not do anything? I'm just curious, what stopped you? If you thought there was something going on, what stopped you?
Hi there, yeah. I think it was... I don't think I was in a position to say something because... So I work for the Samaritans now. Prior to that, I worked in the media sector where, you know, going out for work events were 2, 3, 4 nights of the week. And so not drinking, you know, you're encouraged by senior management to drink because it was all about customer relations and building it. And that's how you networked, by drinking. And so not drinking was kind of the anomaly. And so when we would get back into work the next day and you could see people that were, you know, that had been out all night, that had been drinking into the whole night and then come in late the next day, you could see, I look back now and I could see there were people there that were in, they weren't in a great place. But because this was so widespread across the whole organisation, I felt as though, I can't say anything about X because it's him and the whole team, plus myself on some nights. And so where do you start with... I'm sorry, this probably shouldn't have been the last question, but...
No, it's fine.
I guess where do you start where it's not just an individual, if it's a team, or if it's senior management that you need to engage about a widespread issue?
Well, I think that's a really good question. I think that there's actually on a kind of... There's what we can do within kind of HR functions, etc. But actually, on a much larger level, it's what organisations need to fundamentally start changing, like the boozing. I mean, actually, I was really interested to read about Lloyd's and banning drinking. And now, you're probably all going to have thought what I thought, which is that I thought Lloyd's, going out, client relationships, boozing at lunchtime, they've banned it. I think that's an amazing first step. But I spoke to Nikki, and that's not quite true, is it?
No, it's not true at all. So what they have banned is the structural employees of Lloyd's from drinking, so people who might manage the building, or so all of the brokers...
We were duped, ladies and gentlemen.
So all of the brokers who are housed within Lloyd's, it doesn't touch them at all, that policy.
But the point is that
so it's a good PR exercise. So.
But that's the sort of thing, I think, that has to happen on a more fundamental level. And that's why you need leadership engaged. And it's very difficult just as an individual to effect that sort of change within organisations. But it is going to happen. It really is. But part of it is this whole destigmatisation thing has got to go first and put addiction back into the conversation where it should be. Now, I'm getting a look from over there. So thank you very much for being an amazing audience. Just before we leave the room, I was just going to ask the panellists just one very quick thing. What would you like people to walk out remembering? Maria?
Just say to yourself, I can help this person. I have it. Just by you being there, you can help them. So don't be afraid. And if you're afraid, just talk to someone. Really.
Nikki?
Just keep in mind that addiction is a mistaken attempt at self-care. Okay, and ask yourself 2 questions. If someone is presenting with anxiety and depression, is this addiction or is this withdrawal? Is this anxiety and depression or is this withdrawal? Just ask those 2 questions. And are we enabling, does the culture of our organisation enable and promote, like the gentleman at the back was talking about, yeah?
Alan?
Reduce fear and stigma.
Brilliant. Lovely. Thank you very much for being a great audience.
Thank you very much indeed.